Right? Thanking God this time for the ways in which his wisdom can give us what is sometimes called off ramps to the highway toward conflict, reminding me of a verse in, oh, come on, I think it's Proverbs 17:11, that says the beginning of strife is like letting out water. So quit before the quarrel breaks out, reminding me of the way in which Luke chapter 6 marks an escalation of the conflict between Jesus and the assorted group that I often call the Pharisees, but it's the Pharisees as a part of a larger group that is now about to escalate the conflict with the Christ in much the same way we saw Matthew and Mark describe in their descriptions of his life. And so let's call Luke chapter 6 escalation as their escalation in low key, seeming to try to find a way to already get rid of him in the form of a crucifixion, even if the crucifixion wasn't what they had in mind now, is going to lead to him not so low key, escalating the tone of his warnings in this chapter that we'll call, or sorry, in this chapter that describes something similar to what we saw in Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, what Luke will seem to describe as the Sermon on the Plain. Either way, chapter 6 is going to seem to pick up the baton from the previous chapter's conflicts. As we saw, they began to question him. The questioning is now going to turn more rigid or calculated. As in the last chapter, we saw that they were finding problems with the way that he seemed to step out of his lane and forgive sins as opposed to simply healing ailments. Likewise, they found a problem with his company, the company he was keeping with the tax collectors and the sinners. And then finally, the company he was keeping with his own disciples, as they didn't seem to be dedicated enough, or not as dedicated as the disciples of John and the Pharisees, who seemed to outfast them, even if they were not about to outperform them, understanding the things that Christ was about to accomplish, not through his own hands, but likewise through the hands of those same disciples. Those disciples are going to be the subject of the criticism beginning in verses 1 through 5 of chapter 6, as they are picking heads of grain on the Sabbath, and the Sabbath is going to seem to mark that escalation that we mentioned, because it's not going to stop there, because in verses 6 through 11, he this time, seeing the way that they've challenged his disciples on the way that they are feeding themselves on the Sabbath, he is going to ask them whether or not it's okay to heal on the Sabbath. Both of those violations potentially escalating the previous disputes to something that would now give them justification to actually kill the Christ, understanding that violations of the Sabbath before have basically provoked, going way back to the earliest times of the law when the man was picking up sticks on the Sabbath, that was a motivation for God to tell them they had to stone the man to purge the evil from among them. And so in the back of their minds, understanding the law and the history of the consequences, they are now escalating the types of challenges that they are lodging against the Christ, and he is not backing down. Understand, as we said, the first 5 verses show them lodging that accusation against his apostles, quite possibly standing up for them. He's like, no, don't pick at them, pick at me, because now I'm not just picking heads of grain, I'm healing on the Sabbath. What do you think of that? That seems to be the level of escalation. And with that, they are going to be silenced by his answer, pointing forward to 2 additional times that he is going to seem to either be challenged or challenge their interpretation of the Sabbath law in chapter 13, beginning in verse 10 and verse 16 of verses 1 through 6 of chapter 14. He is going to challenge their own level of work on the Sabbath. Twice, as we've seen in Matthew and Mark, challenging the things that they do with regard to their livestock on the Sabbath, quite possibly being more work than they are accusing him of doing and licensing to be done on the Sabbath. As we said before, showing that they quite possibly have more sympathy for their livestock than they have for the suffering of the people. But the first 11 verses of the chapter seeming to put that level of conflict with the Pharisees and the authorities on pause. He is then going to talk about, or the chapter is then going to describe the way that out of his disciples, he chooses 12 that will be called apostles, going on in verses 17 through 19 to talk about the way that he will turn his attention away from the conflict back to the needs of the people that he's already seemed to insinuate that aren't being cared for properly by the Pharisees, to not only heal them as they come to them, but they are coming to him in verse 18 to hear him and to be healed, setting the stage for the Sermon on the Plain that will go from verse 20 through the rest of the chapter in what I'm going to describe as roughly 2 sections that breaks down ESV wise into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sections. But The reason why I am looking at it in halves may be apparent when we look at the fact that the overlap is going to include his own version of the Beatitudes in verses 20 through 23. But in addition to the Beatitudes, he's going to weave in some woes for what would quite possibly be similar to what we saw in the Proverbs, the way that Solomon would often compare healthy behavior with unhealthy behavior, the behavior of the righteous with those of the wicked. Beatitudes are going to say, blessed are you when you, among other things, are poor and hungry and weep and are persecuted for his sake, because even though the stress is immediate and apparent, the reward, if you're willing to wait, is worth it. Contrasting that to those who actually aren't blessed, even though they might seem to be doing well now, he's going to say it's the rich, those who are full, who are laughing, and who are spoken well of everyone. I'm going to add the qualification, understanding this is my qualification, because they are doing all of these things in a way that compromise their integrity. Understanding that we all have a desire to be loved, to have enough in terms of money, enough in terms of food, and to basically have joy. Those are good desires that can be easily fulfilled in unhealthy ways. And so he is not adding the caveat, but in the context of his teaching. God is not anti-money. He is not anti-joy. He is not anti-having plenty of food, and he is not against being loved. But he over and over warns about the ways in which we will compromise the truth in our character in order to have those things, especially to the degree we are compromising the truth in our integrity, watching other people suffer in a situation where we could easily do something about it if we compromised our own standing with the crowd to speak up and help. Going on, though, beyond the possible contrast he's drawing between those he calls blessed as opposed to those he is warning with woes, he is going to go on to talk about the scope of our affection as his people in verses 27 through 31, talking about the way that those who are really his are going to love beyond the standard boundaries, as he's going to say in verse 27. But I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you, as he's going to go on and talk about that's what distinguishes you, because in verses 32 through 36, he's going to say, even the wicked love those who love them, as is literally going to say, if you love those who love you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. Going on in a third illustration in verse 34 to say, and if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners. Going on, though, in what I guess, you can divide them up in many different ways, but in that second half of the Sermon on the Plain, it seems to organize into three sections that deal with the kinds of ways he will measure repayment to us all, especially his people. Going on to say, seemingly in verses 37 through 42, he is going to measure according to the amount that we have measured to others. Verses 43 through 45, quite possibly talking about he is going to repay us according to the type of things that we have done to others. And he's going to likewise finish off the Sermon on the Plain the way he finished off the Sermon on the Mount, talking about the way in which whatever he repays us will endure according to what foundation we really built on, whether it was the famous foundation of the rock as opposed to the sand, basing our lives not only on the things that we believe about him, but whether or not we were actually building according to the things that he told us, going beyond mere belief to actually structure our behavior according to his counsel. But more in depth on verses 37 through 42. It's the famous passage starting out, judge not and you will not be judged, condemn not and you will not be condemned, forgive and you will be forgiven, give and it will be given to you. Good measure, as we mentioned, pressed down, shaken together, running over will be put into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. As we said, those verses talking about being repaid in the amount, but verses 43 through 45 talking about the type of repayment that we will get. Verse 43 reading, for no good tree bears a bad fruit, nor again does a bad tree bear good fruit. finishing up talking about the way that that manifests in our speech, understanding that our speech will eventually betray the things that we have been meditating on, understanding that James will tell us quite accurately that we can stumble in many ways, but he is talking about the deeper character, understanding that in Matthew's version of this, he talks about we will be judged even by the careless words that we speak. Mercy, God. And understanding that, and likewise, a description of the life of Christ in John chapter 15, God willing, we will present ourselves as the kind of branches that are meditating on good and healthy things, so that God will be motivated to, as John describes it, prune off the faulty parts of us, as opposed to casting us away altogether, because our words actually betray bad character as opposed to bad moments. As the final section of the chapter, verses 46 through the end of the chapter, is going to go forward to talk about the endurance of our blessings, assuming that God willing, he only wants to prune us to make us better. He's going to tell us that the added benefit is endurance, meaning that moving beyond simply hearing his counsel to implementing his counsel in our lives develops the kind of character that from time to time we say he wants to be around forever. The not so low-key warning in the Sermon on the Plain seems to describe the way that the Pharisees, among others, are not developing that character the more they focus on escalating the conflict with the Christ. Reminding me why beyond the Pharisees, we sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. God, please give us the wisdom to de-escalate conflicts that you either never intended for us or you intend for us to just stop.